Hi, what's up? I'm Channel Pup, the mascot for the level-headed fanboy. Welcome to a very special episode of the Spider-Man Retrospective, where we'll be getting reacquainted with the original live-action Spider-Man. These are the Spider-Men that time forgot. Call me ambitious, but it would be a dream come true if this video here were to do gangbusters and play a part in restoring the legacies of these very first attempts at bringing Spider-Man into the world of live action. A pup can dream.
Pulse human, before you may proceed with the video, you need to be scanned to see if you have subscribed to the channel or not. If you wish to survive, subscribe to the channel now. Beep boop, scan successful. Don't forget to like the video on your way out. But remember, all of this content is made possible thanks to the great patrons, and if you would like to become one, you can hit the link in the description below to help Pup Overlord out. Enjoy the video.
The 1971 series The Electric Company was a TV show from the Children's Television Workshop. It was made for the children that had outgrown Sesame Street. The show would feature various live-action sketches and would also serve as a breakout project in the early career of Morgan Freeman, who would play various roles in the show, most notably as Easy Reader, the guy who loves reading. It may be hard to believe today, but Marvel licensed Spider-Man out to CTW completely free, viewing this collaboration as an investment in Spidey and Marvel's pop culture relevance, bringing Spider-Man to new audiences. And obviously this would benefit the CTW as well, because Spidey would become a major draw for the Electric Company show. This would bring us our very first official live-action Spider-Man, as portrayed by dancer and puppeteer Danny Seagren, who would jump on and off of the producer's desk in a Spider-Man costume to audition for the role. And from there, our first official live-action Spider-Man was chosen. However, Danny Seagren's performance was like no other. What's the one thing Spider-Man is known for? Beyond his spider abilities, beyond his everyman alter ego, beyond his harem, beyond his iconic costume. He just can't shut the fuck up. He quips, he jokes, but this Spider-Man is different in that he's mute. Yet, he still manages to get a few wisecracks out there, paradoxically enough. You might be thinking, how is that possible? Well, in a rather ingenious move on CTW's part, this Spider-Man would speak purely through speech and thought bubbles, typically accompanied with a comedic sound effect like a duck quack or something. This was for two reasons. One, CTW were committed to treating Spider-Man as a comic book character and staying true to his roots in that form. Two, they wanted to encourage the show's child audience to read along with the show. Spider-Man would feature in a segment called Spidey Super Stories, which were a series of 3-minute Spidey capers presented like comic books, complete with front covers and narration from the show's different hosts. While Danny Seagren turns in a physical performance, complete with bouncy stunts and actions, much of the superpowered antics are purely illustrated cutaways. None of these sketches would feature any existing Spider-Man villains, okay, I'm starting to notice a trend here, and would pit Spider-Man against larger-than-life personalities. These could feature Spider-Man thwarting a criminal plot from a range of enemies such as the Spoiler, a criminal committed to spoiling everybody's day, Dr. Fright, a guy so frightful looking he can freeze people in their tracks, and other existing IPs like Dracula. But it wasn't always criminals. Sometimes Spidey would be up against a school prankster or locked in competition with Blue Beetle. Wait. Okay, so this Blue Beetle here has no relation to the DC Comics character of the same name. He's a bumbling superhero and Christ, just look at this yo-yo. He's so silly. Typically, these sketches would end with Spider-Man not getting his way, be it missing dinner or not getting the rest that he wanted. He's a man of simple wants, and his commitment to being a superhero gets in the way of that. And it's nice to see that fundamental here in a way that it wasn't present in the 1967 series. The show would start and end with its own Spider-Man theme, and what's interesting here is how this theme acknowledges the lack of any Peter Parker or alter ego with this version of the character, with the final lyric of his theme song being, "Nobody knows who you are." Of course, we fans know who Spider-Man is. Spider-Man is Miles Morales. Okay, that was said jokingly, but I actually kind of meant that. These sketches are charming, enthusiastically presented, and display some love to the comic book funny pages, even if they're not necessarily a comprehensive take on the iconic wall crawler. The costume is faithfully depicted here, and it looks good. It's just a shame we don't have any higher quality images of it, as this show is another that hasn't been preserved in the slightest. I guess preservation was out of Marvel's hands for this one, given that they don't hold any of the rights to the Electric Company as a show. At least, to my knowledge. However, characters from the Electric Company would make their way into a Marvel comic series. Following the popularity of the Spidey Super Stories sketches, Spidey Super Stories would be adapted into a comic book series spanning 57 issues. These would be Spider-Man comics targeted at a younger audience, marketed as easy reads. The comic version of Spidey Super Stories would expand upon the sketches in some fairly notable ways. For starters, the first issue features the origins of Spider-Man, firmly removing the mystery angle to Spidey's identity from Spidey Super Stories lore. As well as this, some classic Spider-Man villains would appear here, but it's all been somewhat simplified. For one example, Peter decides to use his powers to help others all by himself, as there is no death of Uncle Ben depicted here, so to speak. Probably a little dark for the child audience that these were targeted at. The Electric Company cast are all here, as well as some of the villains that Spidey would face off against in the sketches. It's a fun expansion for the kids who were watching the show at the time, and the artwork is really nice too. But something that caught me off guard was when Dwan from the show went on to become Spider-Man in issue 1, making him the first Black Spider-Man decades ahead of Miles Morales. Although, okay, Miles Morales was the first Spider-Man to not just be dreaming that he was Spider-Man. There's a lot of firsts on here with big asterisks next to them. Donald Glut was the first live-action Spider-Man, unofficially. Danny Seagren was the first official live-action Spider-Man, albeit in a series that wasn't his own, nor did he talk or portray any form of Peter Parker. But that was all about to change. Fast forward to modern day. When you think about superhero TV networks, you probably think of the CW with its expansive universe of DC superhero shows, including Arrow, The Flash, Supergirl, and the list only gets bigger from there. But the CW wasn't the first TV network to develop that reputation. In the 1970s, CBS was full of superhero shows, including The Incredible Hulk, Wonder Woman, as well as pilots for Doctor Strange and Shazam. Following the success of Spidey Super Stories, Stan Lee was eager to sell the film and TV rights to Spider-Man and would license the character over to Columbia Pictures, who have held the rights to the character ever since. And so, The Amazing Spider-Man entered production with stage actor Nicholas Hammond cast as Peter Parker and his iconic alter ego, Spider-Man. The show would run for a feature-length pilot and 2 short seasons, with the show targeting a more mature audience. Spider-Man was to be played straight, so to distance itself from the more kitsch adaptations of superheroes like, say, Batman 66. Because of this, larger-than-life action would be kept to a minimum, and the show would feature no classic Spider-Man villains again? Okay, look, it's easy enough to accept that a fan film would want to incorporate its very own villain. And it's kind of understandable that the Electric Company, given that it isn't a Spider-Man show, would be sparing on what it does and doesn't want to adapt. But here we are on official adaptation number 3. And again, we have no Spider-Man villains! Now, I've heard arguments that you couldn't really depict Spider-Man villains on a 1977 TV budget, and I'm calling BS on that. If you can't depict Green Goblin because he flies around on a glider, then don't have him fly around on a glider. The character of Norman Osborn is compelling enough to exist without that. But there are dozens of Spider-Man villains that can be done with minimal special effects, like Kraven the Hunter, Mysterio, the Enforcers, Tombstone, Hammerhead, Chameleon, Kingpin. Literally, stick a dude's hand in a cardboard box and glue a load of sand to the box, you got yourself a Sandman. Dr. Lightning from the 1969 Spider-Man fan film had electric powers, so if a fan could pull that off in 1968, I see no reason why a budgeted TV show couldn't adapt Electro in some way. What's so difficult about taking some grey pool noodles, putting claws on the end of them, and having a dude stand behind an actor, waving them around? And sure, they did admittedly want a more grounded tone with this show, so I can appreciate that. But you can adapt these villains to be more realistic or serious. Electro doesn't have to rock up in a green and yellow suit. Norman Osborn doesn't have to have his Green Goblin suit, and so it goes. With all that being said though, yeah, the cheap and cheerful nature of adapting those characters on a lower budget is the kind of thing that's fun to look back on from today's perspective, but considering the time they probably didn't want cardboard villains and pool noodles, especially considering they were trying to target an older demographic. So the goofiest thing in this show ends up being Spider-Man himself. Spider-Man villains could be adapted on a 1970s TV budget if they were simply willing to get inventive with the filmmaking. But it's no secret that this show actively shied away from its roots as far as Spider-Man adaptations go, especially in its second season. That said, even steering clear of comic book villains and keeping larger-than-life action sparing, the pilot and season 1 were a smash hit with younger demographics. But CBS wanted to appeal to older audiences, so season 2 would rein things in even further. Now you might be wondering, why not just accept the younger demographic and run with it? After all, good ratings are good ratings at the end of the day, right? Well, that's not entirely how this works. See, the younger demographic are less likely to purchase the products in the advertisements, so the advertisers wouldn't put up the money. Good ratings weren't enough, they needed to be ratings from the right demographics in order to appease the advertisers. While it generally shied away from being Spidey-centric, there were some insane stunts on this show. They may not look like much, but trust me, health and safety standards were virtually non-existent for stunt performers back in 1977. So if you saw Spider-Man swinging from a web with no safety equipment, that was actually real. The stunts weren't performed by Nicholas Hammond, but instead stunt coordinator Fred Waff, who may as well be crowned an honorary jackass for some of the crazy stuff he got up to making this show. So while the show released in its original televised format on CBS in the States, the re-release took on a different form in Europe and other territories. Rather than releasing the full series, we instead got a trilogy of theatrical releases. We had The Amazing Spider-Man, which was the untampered feature-length pilot releasing in theaters in 1977. The follow-up, Spider-Man Strikes Back, in 1978, and finally Spider-Man The Dragon's Challenge in 1981. So here's how it worked. Following the pilot, Season 1 would open with a two-part story, The Deadly Dust. But for the theatrical release, these two parts would be edited together and released as Spider-Man Strikes Back. And then for the series finale in Season 2, The Chinese Web, that was another two-parter which would be edited together and make The Dragon's Challenge. So given that I'm European, it stands to reason that I'd watch this series in a format that it was released in my territory, right? Okay, fine, I'll be honest, I watched it as the movies for the sake of brevity. I've got to get this video made before YouTube's algorithm completely loses interest in me, so I don't necessarily have the time to sit down and watch every single episode, even though there admittedly aren't that many. Having the defining episodes of the show edited into features made this a pretty digestible experience, so I went and watched every installment of this trilogy, and I'm going to talk a bit about each one, before offering some concluding thoughts on this version of Spider-Man. If at a later date you'd be interested in me revisiting this show to watch the other episodes, comment below and let me know. Sorry, Jeremy Johns, I just didn't really know what else to say after "and." The first thing to know about 1977's The Amazing Spider-Man. This film is dated. From the fashion sense to the cars to especially the music, this is an aggressively 1970s production. Which I don't mind, but I understand why that might be a little alienating for a contemporary audience. So throughout a very LA-looking NYC, strange things are happening, as random citizens are becoming seemingly entranced and committing crimes. We see a doctor and an attorney entranced going to rob a bank. So then we meet Peter Parker, a college student and freelance photographer for the Daily Bugle, and he's down on his luck. The ever-cantankerous J. Jonah Jameson, as portrayed by David White, is no longer interested in purchasing photographs from Peter Parker unless he ups his game and can find more interesting subjects to photograph. Back at college, Peter and one of his friends, whose name I can't remember for the life of me, are experimenting on a spider using radiation. The now radiated spider bites Peter. As he makes his way home, he's chased after by a car, but Peter finds himself cornered by the car. So he does the one thing we'd all think to do in that situation. He climbs up the wall to get away using only the tips of his fingers and the heels of his feet. We're then introduced to a fairly major character in this film, Captain Barbera, a no-nonsense, wise-talking police captain who, if anything, feels a bit more like the true J. Jonah Jameson we know and love than the actual J. Jonah Jameson in this film. There's a fun dynamic between Peter and Captain Barbera, as Barbera is frustrated by Peter having to be so committed to his studies, offering no answers to the crime scenes that he finds himself present at. From here, it's almost comedic how quickly this film speedruns through the Spider-Man origin story. So Peter foils a mugging with his new powers and word spreads of a Spider-Man in New York. He goes to tell J. Jonah Jameson and Robbie Robertson about the Spider-Man, and they begin grilling him for information, which he makes up as he goes. It's here where Peter decides on his motivations and that Spider-Man would wear a costume and do good. He tells Jonah he has pictures of Spider-Man at home, and so he hurries off to make his Spider-Man costume. We meet Aunt May, Peter's doting aunt who has virtually no presence in this film, other than to remind Peter to take an allergy pill while he's secretly working on the Spider-Man costume in his room. Uncle Ben is nowhere to be found in this film, as, like Spidey Super Stories, Peter just decides to become a hero. It's strange to me that they were so hell-bent on pitching this show to adult viewers, yet they didn't adapt the death of Uncle Ben, the sobering life event that took Peter from ignorant boy to Spider-Man, the grounding anchor of that origin. From here, though, a mystery unfolds as the mayor is sent extortion notes that if he does not pay $50 million, the crime wave will continue and 10 New Yorkers will commit suicide. Peter is sent to photograph another crime scene from an entranced individual, Professor Tyler. The professor's daughter, Judy, doesn't believe that her father would ever commit a crime like this, so Peter talks to her to find out more about the situation. Judy tells Peter that her father was attending a spiritual self-help program, and that perhaps the guru of that program will have some understanding of what has befallen her father's mind. So Peter joins Judy as the two head to the hospital with the professor. But when the professor attempts to jump out of the multi-story hospital window, Spider-Man springs into action to rescue him. Perhaps the funniest thing about this, though, is how drawn out these wall-crawling scenes are. Spider-Man climbs up one side of the building all the way up to the roof, only to climb back down to the window where the professor is about to jump. Why not just climb to that window, you big silly? What a meatball, am I right? So Peter and Judy attend a conference to meet the guru Edward Byron, whose methods seem a little extreme. So Peter is skeptical, but Judy on the other hand is convinced and decides to join the program for a little peace of mind following the disturbing events that have taken place in her life. So back home, Peter creates his web shooter, and we get one of the only 3 web swinging shots in this film. Peter swinging from something I think would be a bit too generous to call a tree, but a bit too cruel to call a branch. This scene could kind of just slot in anywhere. I'm surprised it didn't just come straight after the costume reveal. So while citizens are being entranced, Peter's computer begins picking up a mysterious radio signal, so he suits up and goes to track it. A fun detail here is that Spider-Man forgot to take his allergy pill, so he keeps sneezing as he investigates the signal, which he tracks to Byron's clinic, where he's jumped by 3 henchmen. Now, I suspect that this Spider-Man's only superpowers are climbing and his spider sense. His web shooter is of course mechanical, but he doesn't display any heightened strength or agility. He gets pretty bodied by these henchmen who, yes, are skilled combatants, but are still only human. And so Spidey flees the scene, with the guru now aware of his presence. So Peter goes to warn Judy about the guru over the phone, but he's sent to voicemail, so he decides to investigate from the inside himself. As Peter Parker, he goes to sign up for the Guru's program where he's given a membership pin and put into a trance, where he's instructed to jump off of the Empire State Building at noon the next day. Now knowing what the signal is, Peter suits up as Spider-Man to head back to the clinic and investigate further, but he's intercepted by the henchmen who knock him off of the roof. To save himself from his fall, he grabs onto a statue but breaks his hand in the process. Spidey tries to hitch a ride home, but the taxi driver is too apprehensive of Spider-Man to drive him, so Spidey hitches a ride in a dump truck. So the mayor agrees to deliver the ransom to the Guru via seaplane, allowing the Guru to maintain anonymity while Peter reports the Guru to Captain Barbera. The two agree to work together to jam the signal. But as he makes his way to the Captain, he gets caught in the Guru's trance and heads for the Empire State Building. Captain Barbera arrests two of the Guru's henchmen in their seaplane, and so the Guru commands Peter as the first person to jump. But very conveniently, the fencing at the wall pushes his pin off of his jacket, which gets him out of his trance, because the pin was the transmitter. I don't know if I made that clear. The movie did, so that's my fault in that case. Now out of his trance, Peter suits up as Spider-Man, heads back to the clinic, and pulls down the satellite dish, reversing the signal back at the Guru, who is now caught in his own trance, while everyone else is saved from grim fates. So Spider-Man heads in to defeat the Guru once and for all, but is met by the Guru's henchmen. And the scene ahead here is both oddly wholesome and equal parts hilarious.
Enough's enough. Now, I reversed the microwave, so let's be buddies, all right?
The henchmen all smile and let Spidey in to the Guru's office, where Spider-Man finds him defeated and entranced. He instructs the Guru to turn himself in to Captain Barbera. With the Guru now defeated, Jameson tells Captain Barbera that he'll be reported as the true hero in this caper in the Daily Bugle paper. MC Pup bringing in the heat with these rhymes. This is one of the only times in this show that Jameson shows any kind of disliking towards Spider-Man, as from here he doesn't really express any kind of distaste for the web-slinger. Captain Barbera declares Spider-Man as his ally, but he chastises Peter for not helping him to jam the signal. But Peter is at least able to bring J. Jonah Jameson his pictures of Spider-Man in action, and so he's rehired at the Bugle. When Jameson asks Peter how he's the only one able to get good pictures of Spider-Man, he responds,
Simple. I believe.
And so the film ends. To be completely honest with you, my expectations for 1977's Amazing Spider-Man were toilet tier, and I was so pleasantly surprised that I actually enjoyed this film. I think it's pretty good. Sure, there are some questionable omissions, such as the lack of Uncle Ben, and the pacing is incredibly uneven, with some scenes dragging out and others just speedrunning, but what's here is a solid mystery story, even if it's a little fast and loose as a Spider-Man origin. While it's frustrating to once again have no classic Spider-Man villains, the Guru is at least a solid villain with a frightening plan. I feel like the Guru's plan, if anything, has aged well, given that we're now far more conscious of mental health today than we were in the 70s, and the predatory schemes that will take advantage of the emotionally vulnerable. The action is pretty laughable even by the standards of the time. It's impressive to think that an actor was actually climbing walls and swinging from ropes, but it's also basic and silly looking. The 1969 fan film actually did a better job with this, in my opinion. With that being said, there are some pretty cool directorial decisions here from the director with the greatest name I've ever heard in my entire life. E.W. Swackhammer. Okay, there is no way that's his real name. Let me look that up. Okay, no way. His real name is Egbert Wonderink Swackhammer Jr. That's the greatest name I have ever heard. I love the use of POV shots for wall crawling and web swinging shots, and the scenes where citizens are becoming entranced are really genuinely kinda creepy. It's complemented by the music as well. And then, of course, there's Nicholas Hammond as Peter Parker and Spider-Man. He does a great job as Peter Parker. I'm definitely not sold on him being a kid, so making Peter college age here was a good move. He plays that mild-mannered, charming young man very well. As for Spider-Man, he may as well be a mute. Spider-Man barely says anything in this film, and the majority of the time he looks like a lost cat. Now, it is worth noting that Hammond spent very little time as Spider-Man, so not much of that probably falls onto him. The Spider-Man scenes were typically performed by the stunt performers, but don't let me be caught dissing them because, as I say, doing all of this Spidey stuff practically has major risks. Still, there's none of that Spidey wit, none of that banter. Spidey is being fully played straight-laced, which is a shame. That said though, I do like the costume. It's primitive, yes, but in that regard, maybe you can have an easier time believing that Peter actually made this in his room. The only real detractors, I guess, are the T-strainer circular eyes, but even then, they're not bad. The suit would evolve a little over time, gaining a utility belt, which I don't really mind. Spidey's always had a utility belt. It's just usually hidden under the top half of his costume. With that being said, you'd definitely be able to see that under there in live action, and it would probably look a bit of a mess. I don't know. Still, it's a very classic look. They've captured Spidey's appearance well here. On a whole, it's a solid film, and it's probably worth checking out if you're a Spidey fan interested in seeing where his cinematic legacy truly began. The follow-up, Spider-Man Strikes Back, would release in 1978. The film opens with Spider-Man rescuing a suicidal woman who's about to jump. Okay, seriously, what is it with these movies and suicide so far? This causes a journalist called Gail Hoffman to take a keen interest in Spider-Man, determined to interview him. She meets Peter Parker and the two discuss Spider-Man, where Peter basically tells her everything but the fact that he's Spider-Man. He's oddly fast and loose with his secret identity here, making what would otherwise be pretty baseless assumptions about his character. It's funny the lengths he goes to basically say he's Spider-Man, all while insisting he's not Spider-Man. So Peter's college professor announces that the class will be experimenting with plutonium, and Peter's classmates object to this due to fears of nuclear war. Pretty relevant at the time of this film's release, given that the Cold War wouldn't truly end until 1991, over a decade later. The professor plays down the students' concerns, and so they decide to put on a demonstration in secret. They steal the plutonium and use it to build their very own atomic bomb.
Huh?
Now, in fairness, this actually tracks. I consider myself to hold progressive values, but I can safely say I've witnessed a lot of hard-edge progressives shoot themselves in the foot. Remember when Peter, the people for the ethical treatment of animals, took a little girl's dog and just decided to have the dog put down? Who knows why mad people do what they do? But the student dorm is broken into by robbers who attempt to steal the atomic bomb, but they're thwarted by Spider-Man. Campus security are alerted and Spider-Man is accused of stealing the plutonium. Meanwhile, Mr. White, an arms dealer who I guess just reads a lot of newspapers with bikini-clad women, just happens to read about Spider-Man stealing the plutonium. But he knows better and deduces that the students must have stolen the bomb. Namely, Peter Parker, because he's the only one smart enough. So he heads to New York to obtain it with his henchman, Angel. One of the students gets radiation poisoning, so the students head to the hospital, leaving the bomb free for Mr. White and Angel to take. God, these are the stupidest students ever. Spider-Man attempts to stop Angel, but is hurled off of the building, saving himself in a web net. From here, Mr. White makes a series of threats to set off the bomb in populated areas, including the World Trade Center. God, why is it always the World Trade Center? So yeah, it's another extortion attempt. If he isn't paid $1 million, he's gonna blow up the city. But instead he decides to set his sights elsewhere and heads to LA with the bomb, planning to use it to kill the president during a speech. So Peter puts a tracker on his car as he leaves NYC. So Jameson, Peter, and Gale head to LA together to investigate Mr. White. Jameson this time played by Robert F. Simon. It's fun to have Jameson along for the adventure this time. Peter tracks the atomic bomb and, realizing that Peter is onto them, Mr. White sends his henchmen to close in, where we get a fun scene of Spider-Man and Mr. White's henchmen fighting in a Hollywood studio backlot resembling the Wild West. Mr. White, realizing Gale is closing in on him, kidnaps her, forcing her to wear a bikini so she can't store any weaponry, and because he's just a dirty old man like that. This was probably fan service back then, or maybe it was, trying to aim at that older demographic. So Spider-Man goes to rescue Gale before webbing onto Mr. White's helicopter, dangling over LA. Once again, these stunt performers are crazy. The stunt performer here literally broke one of his hands filming this scene, so he could only hang on to the web, or rope in real life, with one hand. As said before, the 1970s was a wild west as far as health and safety standards for stunt performers went. Spidey is able to reach the bomb and disarms it, saving the president and LA. Not very based of you, Spider-Man, considering Reagan would have been the president at this time, but hey ho, I'm not about nuking people either. Gale and Peter flirt some more, with Peter implying that he's Spider-Man again, but still refusing to admit it. The end. Spider-Man Strikes Back isn't quite as good as its predecessor. I mean, go figure. One was an event status pilot, this one is 2 episodes stuck together. But it's still not bad. It feels like Peter himself is far too involved in these capers though, detracting from his everyman status. He's effectively a double agent at this stage. The Spider-Man persona is kind of made redundant when Peter Parker is out in the field, known to his enemies. With that being said, Spider-Man Strikes Back is a perfectly satisfactory espionage thriller, and Mr. White, like the Guru, is actually a decent villain. On a whole, it's not bad. Entertaining enough, kinda thrilling. Gotta say, I'm surprised by how much I'm enjoying these films. As a first attempt at live-action Spider-Man films, they're not exactly a comprehensive adaptation of Spider-Man, but for their time, there's enough Spider-Man in these films for me to go, yeah, that was satisfying. Going into these movies, I was expecting to be bored out of my little monkey brain by a show that felt like it had minimal relation to Peter Parker and minimal screen time from Spider-Man. And fortunately, I was proven wrong by these movies. With the exception of just one. They managed to meet my expectations at the very, very last minute with Spider-Man: The Dragon's Challenge, an aggressively dull, tedious film. Which is insane because the film is literally called Spider-Man: The Dragon's Challenge. Like from that you'd expect, I don't know, Spider-Man martial arts fights, or some crazy Eastern warrior trials, but nope, what we get instead is a story that on paper sounds a lot better than it actually ends up being, and has pretty much nothing to do with Spider-Man whatsoever. Bear in mind, this is not only the finale to this Spider-Man film trilogy, but served as the finale to the show too. So just a generally dull way to close this show out, which is especially bizarre because it should be kind of exciting. The premise on paper really is. It's a story about legacy, defamation, and truth, and Spider-Man having to kind of restore that. But okay, let me kind of just go into this and maybe you can see what I'm complaining about. So over in China, there's a $1 billion contract going for a power plant build. Min Lo Chen is the Minister of Industrial Development in China. But not for long, as the Chinese government accused him of treason during the war. So Min Lo Chen was looking at one contractor for the job. However, a rival industrialist, Mr. Zyder, knows that if Min Lo Chen is incarcerated, or worse yet executed, he'll get the contract instead. So he frames Min Lo Chen of accepting American money for Chinese government secrets during the war. And he does have evidence of this, as Min Lo Chen was indeed offered money by 3 US Marines for Chinese government secrets, but he never accepted at the time. So Min Lo Chen flees to America with his daughter Emily to find the Marines and gain their testimony to clear his name. But Mr. Zyder has sent an assassin to ensure that Min Lo Chen doesn't return to China. It sounds cooler than it is, as pretty much all of this is explained in dialogue. Now, even if it does sound cool on paper, what exactly does this have to do with Spider-Man? Well, it turns out that Min Lo Chen is a childhood friend of J. Jonah Jameson, and he goes to him for help, telling him his story. So Jameson sends Peter to help Min Lo Chen. Peter agrees and goes to meet him and Emily, but they're ambushed by the assassins. Peter flees, suiting up as Spider-Man to fend off the assassins, but Min Lo suffers from a heart attack and is sent to hospital after his rescue. This also makes both Peter and Spider-Man targets of Mr. Zyder, as they attempt to assassinate both Peter and Spider-Man. They actually successfully shoot Spider-Man on the railroad tracks. As the train leaves, Spidey gets an opening to escape, change back to Peter Parker, and his first instinct is to get a hot dog. I respect it. I'd do the same. No, I wouldn't. I'd be, writhing in pain, feeling very sorry for myself that I got shot. So Peter tracks down the last surviving Marine, Professor Dent, a man also seeking to clear his name after being wrongly accused of treason due to the same incident. So to protect Minlo, the Daily Bugle publish an article declaring his death of a heart attack, and Peter, Emily, and Dent head to China to testify Minlo's innocence. There they soak up the scenery and culture for a laboriously long time. But hey, Emily Chen does have a little subplot about wanting to get in touch with her Chinese roots as a Chinese American. So maybe this is relevant to that. But it's not long until Mr. Zyder kidnaps Professor Dent to ensure his silence. Spider-Man chases after the kidnappers, but he's tranquilized and falls into the river. The residents help Spider-Man out and he's taken to hospital, where he's treated and unmasked in front of Emily Chen. So Spider-Man goes to the rescue, chases down Zyder to his head office, beats off his henchmen, he staves off their attacks and beats them in combat is what I mean. Grow up. And he captures Mr. Zyder, helping Dent escape. So I guess off-screen they testify Minlo's innocence, clearing the names of both him and Professor Dent. Peter and Professor Dent part ways, while Emily decides to stay back in China. She and Peter share a little smoochy smooch, and she loudly promises to keep it a secret that he's Spider-Man in a public airport. Yes, Peter Benjamin Parker from Queens, New York City. I promise to keep it a secret that you are Spider-Man. Hey, I guess English isn't the native language at this airport, so maybe it's okay. And that's the end of this film and this version of Spider-Man. I'm not going to say that film is horrible or anything, just very, very drawn out, and Spider-Man ends up pretty redundant. Heck, Peter Parker feels like a side character this time too. If you were to ask me who the heart of this film is, I'd say Emily Chen, as she pretty much guides Peter for much of this film and has the most emotional stock invested in this story. At this point, the Daily Bugle is basically a secret agency, with Peter being a secret agent. Once again, he's so in the field that it makes me wonder why he even bothers with a separate persona for Spider-Man. Heck, he never has a consistent love interest here. He's a bit of a slut that way. And Aunt May plays such a little role in this show, only appearing in the first film of this trilogy, mind you, that it's like, who are you trying to protect with this secret identity thing? That's more a problem with this whole series, though, than it is just this film. I just feel like this story kind of typifies that, as Spider-Man barely factors in here, nor does he really get much in terms of screen time. The Dragon's Challenge isn't terrible. It's a satisfactory globe-trotting espionage film, it just doesn't have much to do with Spider-Man. It's clear that this film wanted to make some room to show that they actually shot stuff in China. And I think that's why a large chunk of this film is just devoted to showcasing Chinese culture and customs. And Emily Chan's arc makes space for that. But sadly, it's just too much time spent for too little actual development. Nor is Emily Chan really an active participant in any of these scenes, which just feel divorced from the rest of the movie. I'm sure it's a budget flex, I'm sure it was expensive filming in China. But you know what I'd rather that budget be spent on? Some actual comic book villains, or a story that actually has something to do with Spider-Man. Mr. Zyder is also the weakest villain in this trilogy, as we barely spend any time with him. We also never revisit Minlo Chen after the mission to see him resume a peaceful life, so there's not really any payoff there. The pacing is just all over the place as the first act speeds through the basic character motivations, but we then linger on lengthy scenes of Peter trying to track Professor Dent from a helicopter. Given that these were Season 2 episodes while Spider-Man Strikes Back was compiled of Season 1 episodes, there have been some changes between seasons which make themselves apparent here. For one, J. Jonah Jameson has been drastically toned down here. No longer the cantankerous miser he was in the previous film, he has a profound and spoken respect for Peter Parker. He's not really recognizable as Jameson anymore. Character development? I guess I'll just have to see the other episodes to verify that. Also, there's a new theme music that plays whenever Spider-Man is on screen, and I have to say, it goes pretty hard. Dated? Yes, but that doesn't make it any less awesome. Spider-Man: The Dragon's Challenge also showcases a few major actors before they really got their big breaks. The film features a young Rosalind Chow, as well as a brief appearance from a young Ted Danson as Major Collins. The Amazing Spider-Man would be cancelled after just those 2 short seasons, as CBS were looking to refocus their network, moving away from superheroes to more mature content to appease their advertisers. And so, The Amazing Spider-Man would bow out, with no remaining legacy, so to speak. Nicholas Hammond is something of a forgotten Spider-Man. He definitely had enthusiasm for the role, as after the show's cancellation, he was in contact with Bill Bixby, who played Dr. David Banner in The Incredible Hulk show. Hammond and Bixby wanted to bring Spider-Man and the Hulk to the screen for a team-up movie, with Spider-Man donning the black suit. But this never came to be due to rights issues between Columbia and Universal Television. Some things never change. Hammond also expressed that he wanted his Spider-Man to return alongside Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, and Tom Holland for Spider-Man No Way Home, but it just wasn't meant to be. This version of Spider-Man is sadly almost never in the conversation when it comes to live-action Spideys or cinematic Spideys. Heck, if there's one thing that's known about this show, it's that Stan Lee didn't like it, feeling that it didn't properly represent the normality of Peter Parker or the excitement of Spider-Man. I don't disagree with Stan Lee. As I said, the Spider-Man persona feels redundant in these films because Peter is effectively a secret agent. But at the same time, I feel like we can look back now and appreciate these as the humble beginnings to Spider-Man's live-action odyssey. The Amazing Spider-Man and Spider-Man Strikes Back were good films, and fairly noble attempts at telling Spider-Man stories in live action. They're modest, but noble efforts. I think part of the reason why these films are so divorced from the conversation surrounding live action Spider-Man is that Marvel have effectively buried this show. There have been absolutely zero attempts at preserving this in any way, shape, or form. There's no home release beyond some VHS tapes from the time. And the only way to really watch this show now is through bootlegs or piracy. The first live-action Spider-Man movies have effectively been abandoned to the Wild West of time, and I think that's a damn shame. And it sucks that Marvel shy away from this part of their cinematic legacy. That said, I guess pick your poison. Dead actors being sloppily resurrected using AI in the Flash movie, or Marvel taking this show around the back of the barn and shooting it dead. While no, I don't think it was wise for Nicholas Hammond to play any major role in Spider-Man No Way Home as Spider-Man, I don't think Marvel should shy away from this run as much as they do. Put the show on streaming so we can see it in decent quality. Let's get Funko Pops, merch, a Marvel Legends figure. Why not have him in Beyond the Spider-Verse for a cameo? These were the first live-action Spider-Man films. Let's embrace that. Welcome to an extraordinary chapter of the Spider-Man TV show Retrospective, as we wade through the fascinating world of the 1978 Japanese Toei Spider-Man Tokusatsu series.
Wayne is boss, Zuki Zuki Zuki. Fuzikazi mara no funky action in a ping pong.
Today, we swing back in time to 1978 to explore the unique fusion of Marvel's iconic hero with the mesmerizing charm of the tokusatsu. But I know what you normies are thinking. What's a tokusatsu? Well, I can give you that answer, for I have all the facts. I totally didn't have to look it up. Derived from the Japanese term special filming, tokusatsu is a genre of live-action entertainment that blends practical effects, pyrotechnics, and crazy visuals to create the over-the-top spectacle that you'd expect from projects like Super Sentai. Whether it's rubber-suited monsters, space battles, or risky stunts, tokusatsu is basically Japanese filmmaking that goes relentlessly hard on ridiculous spectacle. For Toei's Spider-Man, the tokusatsu genre broke new ground as it took on the challenge of adapting a beloved Marvel character. The fusion of Marvel's iconic superhero with the over-the-top creativity of tokusatsu brought an incredibly out-there take on Spider-Man, who would go on to achieve cult classic status, eclipsing his USA live-action counterpart, who would crawl his way onto screens at the same time. Toei is a powerhouse in the Japanese entertainment industry. It's best known for its diverse catalog of film and television productions. The Sonic fans among you may also recognize the name, as it was Toei who would produce the opening and ending animations for Sonic CD. Founded in 1949, Toei forged a legacy in the entertainment industry, producing a vast array of iconic characters and series that have left a lasting impact on pop culture. They're best known for projects like Dragon Ball, Power Rangers, Sailor Moon, and Shin Kamen Rider. And with Marvel venturing into new territory with their licensing, Toei's reputation for larger-than-life stories made them a compelling production company to bring Spider-Man to the Japanese market. And so, the late 1970s brought a 3-year licensing deal between Marvel and Toei, an alliance that would leave a greater impact on the tokusatsu genre than one may initially expect. The deal would allow Marvel and Toei the use of each other's intellectual property, with Marvel using Toei characters in their Shogun Warrior comic series, and Toei producing a Super Sentai-inspired Spider-Man TV series for Japan. Obviously, Marvel licensing out their IPs was nothing new, but this was more than just that. This was an unprecedented cultural exchange between companies. The success of Toei Spider-Man laid the groundwork for future cross-cultural superhero adaptations. This deal set the stage, brokering global expansion of Western superhero media. So, how the heck do you draw inspiration from Super Sentai for a Spider-Man series? Well, that's what makes Toei Spider-Man so fascinating. New York is integral to Spider-Man. He's the all-American hero. His costume is literally red, white, and blue. This is a guy whose first instincts upon gaining superpowers were to become a TV wrestling star. It doesn't get much more American than that. Part of Spider-Man's charm is that he and his world are more grounded than most other superheroes. He's the relatable everyman. So how the hell do you blend that with Super Sentai inspiration? As comic fans, we love a faithful adaptation here, made with as much love for the IP as we fans hold. The Spider-Man tokusatsu is barely even an adaptation of the source material to begin with. Toei's Spider-Man is a total reimagining of Spider-Man. For starters, in this series, Spider-Man does not face off against any of his iconic enemies. I'm gonna fucking vomit. Okay, admittedly, I didn't expect it from this one, given how outlandish this show is. But so far, across Spidey's TV history, from 1967 to 1978, only Spider-Man 67 seasons 1 and 3 would feature classic Spider-Man villains. Okay, we had Kingpin for one episode in season 2, but to that end, I don't even know if I can consider season 3 as new content, given that 99% of the classic villain appearances are just sliced from previous episodes. Between that, the Electric Company, the Amazing Spider-Man CBS series, and now this, there's a clear neglect for Spidey's classic enemies, but we'll talk more about that later, as this show doesn't just omit the classic Spider-Man villains, it omits the entire cast. Even Peter Parker. This is a complete, from the ground up, recreation of Spider-Man made to appeal to Japanese TV audiences, which is especially interesting given that they left Spider-Man's appearance alone. The costume isn't too dissimilar from the one that Nicholas Hammond will have worn on the CBS Spider-Man series. The key difference here being his chunky wrist bracelet and the fact that he no longer has those disc-shaped T-strainer eyes. Instead, he's got these sparkly Ditko-looking eyes, and it has to be said, it looks a lot better. Wearing the red and blue this time is Takuya Yamashiro, our new Toei Spider-Man. The choice to create a new, unique character like Takuya, rather than directly adapting Peter Parker, was actually kinda a great decision by Toei in retrospect. It allowed the writers to get really creative with Spider-Man, meaning that there's no betrayal to that original Peter Parker character with the changes made. Instead, Japan gets his very own Spider-Man, and I think that's just great. The idea of different spider people representing different cultures is one that's only gotten more popular in recent years. We've got our Spider-Man of Queens in Peter Parker, our Spider-Man of Brooklyn with Miles Morales, and in spite of all sharing the same mantle, they are their own characters, their own personalities that would take on the mantle. And recent projects like Into the Spider-Verse and Across the Spider-Verse have only solidified this philosophy further. Try saying that when you're drunk. So in that regard, Takuya Yamashiro is kinda a trailblazer, as other spider people such as Miguel O'Hara wouldn't become established in Marvel Comics until the 1990s, with the exception of Ben Reilly making his first appearance in 1975. But his adventures wouldn't reach the extent that Takuya Yamashiro's would until also the 90s, which seems to be the era when Marvel really found confidence with other spider people. What Toei were doing with Spider-Man was incredibly out there at the time, as the character of Takuya Yamashiro has almost nothing in common with Peter Parker. He's not a wallflower, he's not a genius, or anything along those lines. Instead, our protagonist draws more inspiration from other popular Toei properties such as Kamen Rider, in that Takuya is a motocross rider. Unlike Peter, he's at odds with his scientific parental background. His story begins with his astrophysicist father, Dr. Hiroshi Yamashiro, calling upon the assistance of Takuya, his sister Shinko, and photographer Hitomi Sakuma to investigate the site of a crashed vessel. However, Takuya is otherwise engaged with a big race. Hiroshi is supportive of Takuya's choice, with the proviso that he wins said race. However, Takuya doesn't stay focused on his racing for long, as a voice in his head calls to him, leading him to the crash site, where Shinko tells Takuya that their father has been attacked. Professor Monster viewed Professor Hiroshi as a threat and had him killed. So Takuya rushes to his ailing father's side, and in his dying breath, Hiroshi tells Takuya of unknown forces invading the Earth in secret. A secret invasion, if you will, except I watched it. He makes Takuya swear to continue his work and save the world. Bit much to ask of a guy, but hey ho, I guess the fate of the world is at stake. So you might as well tell the person nearest to you at the time. It's biker boy or nothing in this case. Mysterious enemies close in on Takuya. Men in grey jumpsuits with chicken beaks who disappear and reappear. They move like ninjas. He goes to fight them and avenge his father, but injured by the attack, he falls into a hidden cave where he meets Garia, an intergalactic ally who's been calling out for help telepathically, with only Takuya, the chosen one, able to pick up his signal. So there's quite a major lore dump here. Garia is an alien explorer from the planet Spider. He returned to his homeworld to find its leaders killed along with his family. Killed by the intergalactic conqueror, Professor Monster. Vowing to avenge his family, Garia tracked Professor Monster down to Earth, where a battle ensued. But Professor Monster prevailed, injuring Garia and trapping him under the ground for 400 Earth years, which is equivalent to 20 years on Planet Spider. So Garia didn't age all that much, all things considered. Maybe he's born with it. Maybe it's Planet Spider. And so it transpires that the ninjas who attacked Takuya were none other than Professor Monster's Iron Cross army. Since then, Garia sent his ship, the Marveler, back out into space, while he called to a brother of Earth telepathically in order to find his successor, to carry on his mission, given that he is too mortally injured to do so. Takuya and Garia share a common goal: to avenge their families and bring down Professor Monster and his Iron Cross army. But Takuya finally succumbs to his injuries and begins fading. In a bid to save him, Garia gives him his Spider-Man bracelet and injects him with his spider extract, imbuing him with the divine power of Spider-Man, and now the responsibility of taking down the Iron Cross army once and for all. Garia would spend his remaining days in his spider form, mentoring Takuya before dying as his little spider self. Gotta wonder if Takuya gave him a dignified burial or if he just flushed him down the toilet. From there, Takuya goes on to become the web-swinging the emissary from hell. Spider-Man with his powers of wall crawling, shooting spider strings and spider nets, his spider sense, ability to see into the future, and his innate ability to talk to spiders. But that's not all, as Takuya has inherited a couple of vehicles from his deceased mentor.
Spider Machine GP7!
Which is a flying car that can shoot guns and missiles, and
Marveler!
his spaceship complete with rockets. But Marveler isn't just a spaceship. With a call from Spider-Man, he can transform into a kaiju mech
Leopardon!
with his own set of unique abilities, including
Arm Rocket!
which it does what it says on the tin, pretty self-explanatory that one,
Leopardon Strings!
which are Leopardon's own set of web powers,
Alpha!
where he chucks his little tiara at his enemies, and
Sodovita!
which is effectively an instant kill to all enemies. Truth be told, it's unclear why he bothers with the whole Spider-Man thing when he could just bring Leopardon with him at all times and just sword vigor the shit out of any opposition. One thing Toei Spider-Man did surprisingly well was how it approached the duality between Spider-Man and his alter ego. Amidst all the excitement of battling kaijus and secret invasions, we do spend time with Takuya's family. Takuya's family brought a much-needed dose of humor and heart to the series. His sister Shinko very much being the woman of the house, or I guess I should say, Minister of Finance, and he's got his little brother Takuji who looks up to him. There's some light-hearted bickering between the family, as Takuya is still a young, impulsive, and frankly goofy man after all. But it's kind of nice to see how they will all pull together after the death of Professor Hiroshi. But okay, if you loved Peter and Gwen in the Amazing Spider-Man movies, you're gonna love this. So we've also got Takuya's girlfriend, Hitomi Sakuma, a photographer unwittingly working for Amazones, Professor Monster's right-hand woman, who is working undercover as a tabloid editor. It's honestly comedic how little chemistry there is between Hitomi and Takuya, as the two constantly bicker. There's very little actual evidence of any kind of affection between the two, with Hitomi often siding with Shinko during disputes. Now, this can be chalked up to it being a kid's show and cultural differences in Japan. At the same time, that doesn't stop the show from being pretty violent at times, with people dying left, right, and center. Heck, this Spider-Man doesn't even have a no-kill policy. He's quite happy to gun down as many Iron Cross members as he can. Now, as mentioned before, we don't get comic book villains, and it does make sense, given that we don't even get comic Spider-Man here, but I think you could also make that work in a similar way to Spider-Man in this show. Sure, Peter Parker isn't here, but he's still wearing the red and blue, he's still shooting webs and climbing walls. So theoretically, it'd be cool to see a Japanese reinterpretation of characters like Green Goblin and Doc Ock, but alas, it wasn't meant to be. We instead have the Iron Cross Army, who generally consist of cannon fodder. They like to make their presence known with their disappearing and reappearing tricks, and yes, they are a threat, but they're also comedic foils too, as they're depicted as a bit goofy and cowardly, and they make silly noises. They also have chicken beaks. Then in charge, we have Professor Monster, pulling strings behind the scenes as he creates his Machine Bems to take over the world. The Machine Bems consist of various different Monster of the Week characters and are generally people or creatures that Professor Monster has cruelly experimented on. Then there's his second-in-command, Amazones, who operates in a more hands-on fashion as she commands the Iron Cross Army and spies on Takuya in a bid to determine Spider-Man's secret identity. Also, she kinda bad though, hear me out. So after the death of Garia, the show becomes super formulaic from episode to episode. Professor Monster hatches up some crackpot plan to lure Spider-Man out and defeat him. Takuya has to drop whatever he's doing and look like an asshole to his family, goes rushing in, does some poses and announces himself as the emissary from hell, or maybe sometimes he'll vary it up a little. This is truly the most relatable Spider-Man, he's just like me. It turns out it's a trap, so he fights off the Iron Cross Army before one of Professor Monster's Machine Bems rocks up to cause trouble. It grows to kaiju size, so Spider-Man calls upon Leopardon to take down the kaiju. Some blows get traded before he finally uses Sword Vigor, and the Machine Bem is defeated. And Takuya goes home to brood about how he'll never know peace until his father and Gaara are avenged. There, I basically explained every episode of the show. Generally, it's super digestible as well. Episodes run at only 20 minutes, and there's a lot of narration just to re-establish deeper lore for first-time viewers, or sometimes give necessary context to certain character moments because the 20-minute runtime doesn't allow the filmmakers to really show it. One example of this is when Takuya and Junko are commemorating their fallen friend Yasuki at sea, and the narrator chimes in to let us know Yasuki loved nature, so this is appropriate. It's pretty lazy, but it's a means of keeping to the 20-minute time slot, and hey, it makes everything incredibly easy to keep track of. Sure, the pilot dumps a lot of lore on the viewer, but everything is nicely clarified in the second episode, meaning that as long as you've seen those 2 episodes, you're unlikely to ever really feel lost in this story. While there is a continuous narrative of Spider-Man seeking vengeance for his father and Gaara, wanting to kill Professor Monster, episodes are pretty self-contained, and you don't really have to watch all of them to get the important story stuff. And heck, you can watch most of this in any order. The only episodes that I would consider essential viewing to get the overall story are the first 2 and then the finale. But why keep to just the essentials? With that being said, I would like to talk about a few of my personal favorite episodes. Episode 3, Phantom Thief 001 vs. Spider-Man. If you enjoy Amazing Spider-Man 13 for its story of an imposter Spider-Man, well, Phantom Thief 001 vs. Spider-Man is basically one of these stories. A robber known as the Phantom Thief is captured by Professor Monster and hypnotized into impersonating Spider-Man, and is then used as a trap to lure in Spider-Man and have him killed by Machine Bem Genyuchu, a creature with the power to blind Spider-Man for short periods of time. Episode 4, yeah, get ready, there's a lot of consecutive episodes I really enjoyed. The Terrifying Half-Merman. Professor Monster's latest Machine Bem terrorizes Hitomi at the harbor, luring in Spider-Man, but as the emissary from Hell tracks the merman, he finds himself trapped in a cage with it, forced to fight. The fight is surprisingly intense. It's worth watching for that alone, but also the first time Spider-Man and Professor Monster meet face to face. The second half gets a little nuts though, with a concept that's incredibly difficult to explain, but basically, Professor Monster has created a computer program to determine Spider-Man's fate and present it to him via nightmares. I think that's how that works. So Spider-Man has a premonition that he'll fall to his death at a waterfall, and yes, he's drawn out to a waterfall by the merman and almost dies, until he calls upon the strength of Gaara and is given a vine to help him back to the surface. Episode 5, Crash Machine GP7, brings the first feelsy episode of the bunch. When an orphan child stumbles upon an Iron Cross Army base, Amazonis commands the Iron Cross Army to kill the kid with a truck. Jesus, these guys really ain't kidding. The truck hits the kid and he's in critical condition, so Takuya agrees to a blood transfusion in a bid to save the child. However, with Gaara's blood, there are of course risks involved. Fortunately, the kid pulls through and agrees to keep Takuya's secret that he's Spider-Man. The two, now brothers, bonded by blood. The kid agrees to return to the orphanage. Episode 6, Shuddering Laboratory, Devilish Professor Monster. A friend of Takuya, Yasuki, who died in a hiking accident, returns to his girlfriend Junko. It transpires that he was killed by the Iron Cross Army and resurrected by Professor Monster as part of a series of experiments involving killing, reviving, and re-killing. Despite Takuya's efforts to keep them safe, Yasuki and Junko are hunted down by the Iron Cross Army, and the reunion doesn't last, with Yasuki being killed by Amazonis, with Junko having to say goodbye to the love of her life all over again. Another surprisingly emotionally resonant episode, if I do say so myself. Episode 7, Fearful Hit Tune Song Dancing Murder Rock. A local club band make a song in tribute to Spider-Man, but they are kidnapped by Professor Monster to infuse the song with a special frequency unbearable for Spider-Man to lure him out. This one is just funny. It's home to the Spider-Man boogie, and it turns out that Amazonis is a marketing whiz. Who'd have known? Episode 16, Fine Dog, Run to the Under of Father. These titles. This isn't mockery, I understand it's all down to very surface level translation. Spider-Man works alongside a dog to help track down a kid's father and rescue him from the Iron Cross Army. Episode 27, Farewell War Buddy, Beloved German Shepherd. The Iron Cross Army kidnap dogs and train them to kill Spider-Man, including the beloved German Shepherd of a child. The dog uses all of his strength to guide Spider-Man to the Iron Cross Army hideout. Yeah, this one is really damn similar to episode 16, but this one ends with Spider-Man barely able to compose himself as he says goodbye to the dog. And once again, his best introduction. There is also the movie, which takes place between episodes 10 and 11, where Spider-Man is made an honorary member of Interpol, an organization taking on the Iron Cross Army, while said Iron Cross Army used Machine Bem Sea Devil to fire torpedoes at oil tankers. Now, this is a movie, but with a big fat asterisk next to it. It was a theatrical release at Toei's film festivals, but it is the exact duration of an episode of the show, clocking in at just 20 minutes. I guess the production values, though, are a little higher in spots. The overall production looks nicer, with better lighting, some ambitious directorial decisions here and there, and there's more of a sense of scope to the action. The audio is also of a higher quality, but that might just be this recording. It's also shot in anamorphic widescreen as opposed to 4:3, so it's really just an episode but with higher production values. While the movie does take place between episodes 10 and 11, when Marvel released it to its website, it was labeled as episode 0, which is just going to be confusing. I mean, I tell you what, it's self-contained, and it does definitely give you a little taster of the overall tone of the show. I think that's the purpose this movie served. But this is by no means the beginning of Takuya's story. The show's finale, The Hero's Shining Hot Blood, sees Spider-Man discovering the hideouts of the Iron Cross Army, and so Professor Monster decides to move to a new base of operations and H-bomb major cities in his rocket. Amazonas uncovers Spider-Man's true identity using a poison, but due to her failure to stop Spidey, there is no space for her on Professor Monster's rocket as he chooses his other lackeys over her. This leads to Amazonas turning against Professor Monster and piloting the rocket without him. Out of spite, Professor Monster shoots the rocket down, killing her in the process. This leading into a final confrontation between Spider-Man and Professor Monster. Oh boy, here we go! The moment we've been waiting for! Professor Monster scales up to Big Monster, so Spider-Man calls upon the Marveler, transforms into Leopardon, and with a single swipe of Sword Vigor, Professor Monster is defeated. Spider-Man looks over as the sunset glistens on the sea ahead of him, declaring his journey over and Professor Monster dead. And that's the end. Boy, what an anticlimax. Okay, the first 3/4 of the finale episode are really strong, with Spider-Man relentlessly gunning down the Iron Cross Army in Spider-Machine GP7, and Professor Monster and Amazonas turning against each other. Also a good way to close out Amazonas' story with her finally finding out that Takuya is indeed Spider-Man, after episodes of her writing it off because Takuya just seems too goofy. But the final showdown between Spider-Man and Professor Monster was over so quickly. There's a reason for it. It won't bring you peace, but it'll bring you clarity. So midway into production on Toei Spider-Man, somehow, Leopardon was stolen. Now, I'm not sure how you go about stealing something like that, but yeah. The studios were broken into, the Leopardon suit was taken, and there wasn't enough budget to make a new one. So, Leopardon's role was noticeably reduced in the second half of the series, with his scenes either relying much more on TV Spidey's old reliable PAL reused footage, or Leopardon would just be absent entirely. Which, to be honest, I don't mind as it would break up the formula a little. Because of this though, yeah. Leopardon couldn't film any bespoke action sequences opposite Professor Monster, and so this fight was over with one swipe of the Sword Vigor. Still, it would have been cool to have had some kind of fight between Spidey and Professor Monster outside of their kaiju forms. I mean, hey, a hurried ending is still a hurried ending, reason or not, sadly. And with the runtime, there was just no time to see what Spider-Man would get up to after the death of Professor Monster. So, is that it? That's the end of Toei Spidey? Are his days as the Iron Cross Killer now over? While there's no kind of epilogue in the show, this wasn't the last we'd see of the emissary from Hell. Unlike the 1977 Spider-Man TV series from the USA, Toei Spider-Man wouldn't be immediately buried following the end of the show, as he'd go on to feature in various different comics, with the first Spider-Verse event featuring the return of Takuya Yamashiro, brought in by Peter and Otto as an ace in the hole with Leopardon to take down the Inheritors. But just as he's about to sword vigor, he's destroyed by the father of the Inheritors. But Leopardon is repaired by Spider-Man 2099 and Lady Spider and brought back in for the battle. Then in Spider-Geddon, we actually get a little retroactive context for Leopardon's abilities, as Otto asks Takuya why he doesn't just lead with sword vigor. Turns out, there's a recharge time. That kinda explains some of it, I guess. We've also got Vault of Spiders, a Marvel-published manga, which features the disembodied head of Professor Monster going on to become Prime Minister Monster in a final battle with Spider-Man in outer space. He is once again defeated by a swipe of Sword Vigor before Spider-Man and Leopardon make their way to Planet Spider. Then in the 2020 run of Spider-Verse, we briefly revisit Takuya now living on Planet Spider. Wait, did he just leave his family and Hitomi behind? Probably for the best, they were always bickering. You're better off without him. Also, a bit of a footnote here, but Leopardon was in Ready Player One. Not in the film, but the novel it's based on. In the film, his role is instead filled by the Iron Giant, possibly due to rights issues with the Toei Company. Today, Toei Spider-Man isn't available to stream anywhere officially, which is especially bizarre as it was made available on the official Marvel website in 2009 before being removed in 2015. Once again, the Internet Archive picks up the slack. It's even more confusing considering Marvel haven't gone to the same lengths to bury this one as they have the CBS Spider-Man. You can still buy official merchandise of Toei Spider-Man, including Funko Pops, Nendroids, a Marvel Legends figure, heck, even an SH Figuarts version. So it's especially confusing as to why we can't actually, watch the show. Officially, anyway. Alright, so let's take a moment to just say, I know that this has been a lot for you to process. You're probably wondering, what the hell was all that about? Toei Spider-Man is about as loose of an adaptation as it gets for any superhero. And when all is said and done, you might be wondering, why would you do this? Well, Toei Spider-Man was never originally intended to be viewed by Western territories. The show was made under an agreement with Marvel that it was to be aired exclusively in Japan. And so, with Spider-Man being a lesser-known character in that territory, changes were made to the Spider-Man mythos to better appeal to the Japanese sensibilities in storytelling. It made sense that Toei would look at what made Super Sentai and Kamen Rider successful and take inspiration for Spider-Man. But why the machine bims? Why the robots? Well, these shows were typically made in partnership with toy companies, and Spider-Man was no exception. Due to licensing issues, they couldn't produce toys of Spider-Man or any Spider-Man characters, but they could produce toys of Leopardon. Speaking of Leopardon, Spider-Man was home to some of the earliest instances of giant transforming robots in the tokusatsu genre. He had paved the way for the Megazords of the Super Sentai series, and even Transformers. Yes, you heard that right, without Marvel transforming into Leopardon, we might not have Optimus Prime and Bumblebee, meaning that Japanese Spider-Man has a surprising legacy in the world of boyish entertainment. The reality is, it was a balancing act between bringing a Marvel IP to the Japanese market and ensuring profitability, so it did make sense that they'd take this direction. What we end up with is a fascinating Elseworld story. As crazy as this interpretation of Spider-Man is, in some ways, I feel it captures the spirit of the Spider-Man comics, maybe even more so than the CBS version. Sure, in that show we have Peter Parker, New York and the Daily Bugle, but with Toei Spider-Man, coincidental or not, we still have the death of the father figure, which we don't have in the CBS version, as Uncle Max died off screen when Peter Parker was young. Sure, Takuya isn't a scientist, but he does come from a scientific background, with his father being an astrophysicist. He's not a photographer, but Hitomi is. And I definitely got more of a sense for the burden of responsibility that comes with being Spider-Man. Him being the only one who can take on the Iron Cross army while the rest of the world is defenseless against them. It also has much more of the spectacle that I would expect from Spider-Man, and unlike the CBS show, Stan Lee actually liked this version, despite other Marvel executives not really approving of it. If you're expecting high-quality storytelling, don't. Toei's Spider-Man is about as intellectually stimulating as Power Rangers, and barely makes any sense half of the time. If you're expecting a faithful adaptation of Spider-Man, get out of here with that. Okay, the costume is pretty much a perfect low-budget translation of the Spider-Man costume, but that's really where similarities start and end. It's an Elseworld story at best, a complete bastardization at worst. But if there's one thing this show succeeds at, it's being entertaining. With flying colors, Toei's Spider-Man is pure entertainment, full of campy charm, over-the-top, low-budget action, and it's a show where its heart is absolutely in the right place, making it tremendously endearing. You can tell everyone involved in this was trying to make this the best show they possibly could. Takuya Yamashiro's portrayal by actor Shinji Todō made him an endearing protagonist. He's a total goofball, but he also does a great job showcasing the journey of a man on a revenge quest burdened with destiny. Furthermore, the supporting cast are all solid as well, as far as I can understand anyway. I don't know, maybe someone who speaks Japanese will come to me and tell me the line delivery is bad. I wouldn't know. I just like it when he screams Marveler. Now again, it's hard for me to really criticize any of the dialogue given that there's no officially translated version of Toei's Spider-Man, so to speak. So the subtitles aren't reworked or anything, they're just very direct translations, which can lead to some oddly hilarious yet oddly harsh interactions.
何がダメなんだよ。
お父様が殺されて怒ってるんだか悲しんでるんだか私にはさっぱりわからないわ。悔しくないの？
Hitomi, what the fuck is wrong with you? Of all of the Spider-Man shows so far in this retrospective, so from 1967 to Toei Spider-Man, I think this is my absolute favorite of the bunch, simply because it's the one that I had by far the most fun with. The creativity on display here also just made it an incredibly endearing watch. We live in a day and age where we as an audience can understand the concept of a multiverse. Actually, a little too well, because Hollywood won't bloody shut up about it. There's a fundamental understanding today that multiple depictions of Spider-Man can coexist in other worlds, be it Peter Parker, Miles Morales, Gwen Stacy, Miguel O'Hara, or in this case, Takuya Yamashiro. So if you want to see another culture's take on Spider-Man, and are willing to put preconceived notions of the character aside, you might just find yourself having a great time with this version of Spider-Man. As for what the future holds for Takuya Yamashiro, well, he was meant to appear in Across the Spider-Verse, with Phil Lord confirming that he was designed for the film. But Across the Spider-Verse is out now, and Takuya Yamashiro failed to materialize. I'm hoping that they're saving him for bigger things in Beyond the Spider-Verse. But there is also every possibility that maybe they just couldn't get the rights from Toei. Time will tell, but I'm really hoping to see him in Beyond the Spider-Verse. I certainly think it's more likely than seeing the Nicholas Hammond Spider-Man return, which is also a damn shame because I'd really like to see a return of that version of the character too. Marvel have a weird tendency of burying these versions of Spider-Man, yet for Takuya Yamashiro, it's a weird halfway point in that he gets merchandise, yet the show is just nowhere to legally watch. Heck, in 2020, the first episode of Disney Plus's Marvel 616 series was all about the Japanese Spider-Man. It would have made some great material for me to reference in this video, but annoyingly, Marvel 616 was removed from the streaming service, so I wasn't able to watch it. Because we live in a day and age, folks, where Warner Bros. Discovery normalized the idea of lost media being commonplace among major streaming services, ushering in a new era of hostility toward consumers and creatives from the major studios. Brilliant, what a time to be alive, thank you. I hate you, David Zaslav. I hate you, Bob Iger. Things that are released should stay released. Otherwise, it is robbery. I'm gonna call it robbery. We were robbed. Next time, we're going to be moving into the 1980s with 2 new shows. A once-thought-lost Spider-Man animated series, and Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. Good God, what am I doing to myself? A man is not supposed to consume this much Spider-Man media. Not in this short of a space of time. So what do you guys think? What do you guys think of Toei's Spider-Man? What do you guys think of my video? Comment below, discuss. And as always, if you enjoyed this video and you want to support more like it, be sure to hit subscribe, hit the like button. In the description below is a link to my Patreon, where for as little as $1 a month, you can get your name in the credits, as well as just really motivating me. A special shout out goes to the patrons in the $10 tier. And listen, guys, I would just really love to do this in Japanese, but I can't. I just can't. I can't speak Japanese, and if I were to try, it would probably come off as very culturally insensitive. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna scream at the top of my lungs instead. So we got, God Goku, Sharif, Dear Denny, Kale Bennett, That Jordo, King K, Legendary Ray Ray, Dr. SP here. It's not the heat, it's the humidity. Be sure to check the heat index before going outside. Sergio, Cyrus the Skeptic, did you know the skin on your elbow is called a weenus? And that concludes the $10 tier ones. Let's move over to the $5 tier. We've got SSS06, Dazzle Fizzle, and Vera Wild. Thank you, good folks, so much for your generosity, and thank you to you, the viewer at home, for watching. Have a great day.